remarks about a Green New Deal. So I hope that's the kind of thing you were expecting. If not, you've come to the wrong seminar. So the founding principles of ecological economics, as I say, these are kind of mine, but I think these are really important. So the first one is that the economy is a biophysical system. If you want to think of the economy, not in terms of the flow of money through it, those of you who've studied economics, which I imagine is many of you, will know that a very early diagram that you get on what is the economy is the flow of money through the economy, in which consumers buy goods from firms which employ labour, who are also firms, and then there's an investment cycle in which interest is paid on money, and the investment goes into capital to help production and so on. That is the flow of money around the economy, and it's often regarded as a circular flow. To ecological economics, that misrepresents quite badly what an economy is. An economy is a biophysical system which sits within the larger biophysical system of the Earth, and the flow that we see in a biophysical model of the economy is the flow of materials and energy which come out of the environment. The natural environment is the only place that they can come from, flow through the economic system, in which process value is created, monetary value and other forms of value, and then come out again and back into the environment. Because the biophysical system of the economy has to conform to the laws of thermodynamics which govern the biophysical system of the Earth. And the first two laws of thermodynamics cannot be bucked. The first of them is, as I'm sure those of you who studied physics will remember, is that matter and energy are in a constant, there is a constant amount of matter and energy in the universe which cannot be reduced or increased. It can change its form, it can change from matter to energy, but there is one lot of it. And the second law of thermodynamics is the law of entropy, which says that without an external injection of energy, and that's quite an important caveat, all matter and energy gradually degrade. They become more disordered. And the second law of thermodynamics explains, for example, how you move from carbon physically concentrated in oil or gas or coal, which gradually becomes carbon dioxide, which is dispersed around, as we know, the whole atmosphere. And that's a very good example of the law of entropy at work. And these two physical laws of thermodynamics govern economic activity, because we are part of the biophysical system in which they rule, which means that there is an amount of energy and matter, and for every ton of it that we take from the natural environment, a ton of it or its energy equivalent goes back into the natural environment. It has to go somewhere. Someone once said, isn't it extraordinary how much waste has gone into the ocean? You may have seen there's lots of stories about ocean pollution. Well, it's not extraordinary at all. If you think about all the matter and resources we take out of the natural environment, where the hell did we think it was going to go? All of that has to go back into the natural environment, and it goes back in a more disordered form. So it starts off as a resource which we can mine and comes out as a pollutant. The second founding principle is that the natural environment has limits. Nowadays, we often talk about these as planetary boundaries, based on the work of the Stockholm Resilience Centre, Johan Rockström and colleagues. But the core recognition here is that the natural environment cannot supply an infinite, ever-growing amount of the services it provides. It has thresholds above which the environmental services, the resources it provides, the wastes it absorbs, the other things that it does, for example, regulate the climate and biodiversity and so on, can dramatically decline in non-linear ways. So there are limits to the amount of we can extract from the environment and the amount we can put into the environment. They are not necessarily immovable limits. There may be things we can do to increase them, but we cannot expect it to do whatever. Thirdly, and this is a really important distinction between an ecological approach to economics and what I and others have called a neoclassical approach to environmental economics, we cannot simply substitute what the Earth provides, the resources it provides, the absorption of wastes and the other services it provides, by human-made technologies. many economists now want to think of the natural environment as a source of, as a form of capital, to rank alongside physical capital and human capital, and sometimes knowledge capital. That's quite helpful in some ways in thinking about the role the natural environment plays, but it's not helpful if we then think that all capitals are substitutable for one another. There is no way of replacing water by a human-made technology. We have not discovered anything which we can replace water with. We have not discovered a way of replacing biodiversity or climatic regulation through human-made capital. And so there are some things which simply have to be done by the natural environment, and that places limits inevitably on the kind of economy we can have. The fourth principle is that human society and the natural world co-evolve, or as Richard Norgaard put it, co-develop. The natural world is not something which exists beyond human society. It is constantly affected by human society, and the value we give to it is a human value. It is what we think it is worth. And we can describe that in terms of the intrinsic values of nature. We can try and find a more spiritual way of understanding nature, but in the end, that very act of describing it as intrinsic is a human act. And human society and the natural world co-evolve. It affects us and we affect it. And the history of natural evolution as well as human evolution is one of the co-development and co-evolution of human society and nature together. Fifth, and this is less in a sense a founding principle, but it's a very important part of the policy end of ecological economics, is that we should be using all kinds of policy instrument in order to achieve environmental goals. One of the things that neoclassical environmental economics did was focus all its attention, or nearly all of its attention, on pricing mechanisms, on so-called market mechanisms, taxes, tradable permit schemes, and so on. And they have their place. But ecological economists, when it comes to policy instruments, are basically institutional economists who think that all kinds of instruments matter, including institutional arrangements. Those things matter too. Regulation, public spending, support for innovation should sit alongside market price adjustments, taxes, and pollution trading mechanisms in order to get the environmental goals we want. So I'm sure there are some others, and I'm sure other people have come up with different founding principles, but those are the ones that I wanted to kind of place on the table as an ecological approach to, an ecological economics approach to understanding the economy and what we should do about it. So then let's move to the eternal subject of economic growth and environmental sustainability. This debate has been going on for at least 50 years, or 49, since the Limits to Growth, a famous report produced by the Club of Rome in 1972, which argued for the first time in a very popular form, it was a best-selling book, that exponential economic growth could not continue forever, but would in the end be environmentally constrained. Interestingly, the Limits to Growth said that those constraints would occur over the next 100 years. So we are only halfway to the point at which that report said that the limits would be reached in many of the different environmental dimensions that it discussed. It's often assumed that the Limits to Growth said we can't have any more growth now, we have to stop now. That was in fact how a lot of people, particularly Greens, interpreted it, but it's not what it said. I don't think this debate now is very enlightening, and we've still got it going on. So I personally am one for whom we need to move on, but we need to move on the basis of a kind of common understanding of where this debate has got to, in my view, and this is my little summary. So firstly, or point number two here, is it clearly is the case that exponential growth of material and at least carbon-based energy, that's not true of solar or wind energy, but of carbon-based energy is not possible. We cannot simply keep taking more materials out of the ground and using more carbon, not because we will run out of the materials, but because the natural environment can't absorb the wastes. And this is why the laws of thermodynamics are so crucial. Every ton we take out of the ground, we've got to put back into the atmosphere. And because it is entropically more disordered, it is much harder to put it back into the atmosphere, and it takes up much more space. And that's our basic pollution problem. You know, as somebody said, the Stone Age did not end because we ran out of stone, and the Carbon Age won't end because we're running out of carbon. As we've discovered with shale oil and gas over the last decade or so, there's still tons of hydrocarbon in the Earth's crust. The problem is that there isn't tons of atmosphere into which to pour it. And that is also true of most of the other, of many other materials. So we can't simply carry on using materials and carbon-based energy exponentially growing every year forever. And certainly we can't carry on growing in the way that we have been doing, which is largely exponential growth, not completely, there has been some decoupling, but there is no way we can continue with the patterns of the past. That statement, number 2 here, should be universally agreed. And any economist that doesn't think this is not living in the real world, literally, and this should be an absolutely mainstream proposition. The interesting one, of course, is number 3, which is, if it is not possible to grow materials and carbon-based energy exponentially, might it still be possible to grow GDP? And of course, when we talk about economic growth in economics, we are talking about GDP. We're not talking about materials and carbon. And although there has historically been a huge correlation between growth of GDP and the growth of materials and carbon, that correlation is historically specific. It is the particular way in which industrialized countries found to grow. And of course, the growth of GDP was basically made possible by the mobilization of carbon energy. That was the basis of the Industrial Revolution. So it is no surprise that GDP growth and environmentally unsustainable material energy use growth of those have been highly correlated historically. But the question of whether in the future it might be possible to find ways of growing GDP, which is after all simply monetary value, and you're all aware of how GDP is measured. Right? GDP measures market transactions, and market transactions can have completely different degrees of environmental impact. GDP can grow by building more coal-fired power stations, or it can grow by streaming more music. And the difference in the environmental impact of those two kinds of activities is absolutely huge. So the question of whether GDP can grow, even while we limit the growth of material and carbon-based energy, is a different one. And this was all expressed in and the basic relationship was expressed in a famous equation, I think originally invented by Paul Ehrlich, who was one of the early exponents of the limits to growth, which was I equals PCT, where I equals environmental impact, P equals population, C equals consumption, and T is a kind of T stands for technology, but T is what I called in my book, The Green Economy, the environmental impact coefficient of output. That is how much damage to the environment does our each unit of GDP cause. And if I equals PCT is an equation, that is an identity, that is what environmental impact is caused by. It's caused by population times consumption times the environmental impact coefficient of consumption. Then as long as the change in T, that is the improvement in T, is greater than the increase in population and consumption, then I will decline. Now that, it seems to me is theoretically true, but the entire question here is empirical. So is it empirically the case that it is possible to raise T, to improve the environmental impact of a unit of GDP more than population times consumption are growing? And what seems to me to be really important in this debate, and it's one that's caused me to change my view of this, is that the facts have very materially changed from those of 1972 or even the early 1990s when I started writing about this. So Paul Ekins, Professor of Economics at UCL, and I wrote an article in 1993 on I equals PCT, in which we showed what the numbers look like for developed and developing countries, very crude, very stylized, but nevertheless. And we concluded that it wasn't impossible to imagine improving the environmental impacts of GDP growth in such a way as to allow growth to occur, even while environmental impacts were drastically reduced. But today, we are facing a very different situation. And in at least 6 ways, that equation has changed very radically. And it has made me feel that it is probably not possible to achieve GDP growth while reducing environmental impacts to what we would now call sustainability levels. And the 6 factors are, firstly, we are now dealing with multiple environmental dimensions. You may be familiar with this, which is the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is stylized model of the reductions that are required to reach a 1.5 degree trajectory. That is an incredibly steep fall. And we don't only have to do it on greenhouse gas emissions, but we also have to do it in a comparable way. The numbers are different on biodiversity loss, on soil erosion, land degradation, on tropical forest destruction, on fisheries depletion, on ocean pollution, on urban air pollution. We have to make radical, drastic improvements in a whole range of environmental factors simultaneously. This is not just a carbon issue. And doing that is clearly more difficult than doing it for one. Secondly, we have to do it much faster than we did in 1972 or even 1993, because in the intervening period, we've been increasing our environmental damage. So this graph, which shows this very steep reduction that is required to hit the 1.5 trajectory, is much steeper than it would have been if we'd started this process 20 years ago, when the same end point would have been reached with a less steep trajectory, because it would have started lower down. And that fact seems to me to be absolutely material. If when Paul Eakins and I did some first calculations of this in the early 1990s, we thought that you could improve environmental impacts by, say, 3% a year, we're now looking at 7 to 8% a year. And that must be much more difficult while GDP is growing. Thirdly, we, of course, in that time, we've damaged the environment even more. So it's not simply a question of reducing our impacts every year. It's also rebuilding environmental resources and nature. And that, of course, will take more effort too. Then fourth, we have to do this at a global level. So many of these discussions are about national impacts, decoupling and so on, a lot of national studies, but we have to do this globally. We can't simply export our unsustainability to developing countries or China in the way that, by and large, developed countries have with many of our impacts over the last 30 years, where a lot of our reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in the UK and in Europe have been allowed by the increase of emissions in China, importing the goods that we no longer make. And of course, we have to do that finally in a way that is fair to the developing world, and working out how to do all this in a just way that leaves enough resources in the natural environment for people who are currently very poor and who naturally do want to grow is much, much harder. So it seems to me that the empirical nature of this problem of whether you can get growth and environmental sustainability simultaneously is one where the facts have changed and they have moved against the claim that I was once much more comfortable in making, that you can have green growth. But it is still an empirical question. And when various critics of green growth say, but we haven't got decoupling, absolute decoupling of GDP and environmental damage has not occurred, that's not a sufficient argument because we haven't tried. If we were to really try to decouple, we might discover there are other ways of doing it. We would almost certainly do that. We would innovate and so on to achieve that. And I do still regard this as an empirical question. I think the chances of us doing it have much reduced. I'm quite open to the possibility that this is now impossible, but I don't want to rule it out, and for reasons I will give. And I certainly want to say, let's get on with trying it before we conclude that. There are, however, people who don't say that, who argue that it is logically impossible to get GDP growth and with reducing environmental damage, that the rebound effects that are required, that the energy cost of energy, that the core material basis of all production is such that this is not just empirically questionable, but it's logically impossible. Or, and there's another argument going on in what we now know as the degrowth literature, it's impossible under capitalism. These are not quite the same, but they become very similar in the degrowth argument, which is that in capitalism, you can't stop growth because capitalism is founded on capital accumulation. Capitalism is the expansion of the capital base through innovation and interest-bearing banking. And under capitalism, growth is necessary. That's what capitalism requires. And so if you did try and degrow, you would basically have to get rid of capitalism. It's not quite clear whether you would try and get degrowth and discover that capitalism had kind of collapsed, or collapse capitalism first and get degrowth. But degrowth is very much, the literature on degrowth is very much based around the incompatibility of a capitalist system as well as an environmental system with growth. And so the degrowth people argue that we need both to degrow in the sense of contract the economy, and they argue not simply the contraction of material and energy use, which everybody should regard as necessary. That seems to me to be an uncontentious statement, that we need to degrow or contract our material and energy use, but they want to degrowth GDP. And eventually we need to achieve, after degrowth, some kind of steady state economy, a concept originally defined by Herman Daly, the great ecological economist, in order to keep our society in some kind of biophysical balance. These debates have been going on, as I say, for about 50 years, and I now take part in seminars that are more or less identical to the seminars I took part in the late 1980s and early 1990s. What's the conclusion from that? Well, one conclusion is that I'm very old. The other one is that this debate really hasn't moved on, and that all we're seeing now is a new generation of younger people getting to grips with the same issues and having exactly the same arguments as people like me did when we were your age. Many people, therefore, in this debate, or an increasing number, are looking at a new term, which is post-growth, which is the idea that the growth debate isn't helpful anymore. We simply get locked in this growth, green growth, degrowth cycle, and that we should instead move to a post-growth world, one where we acknowledge, which almost everybody in this debate can now acknowledge, that growth in the way that we've achieved it over the past 40 years doesn't generate any of the things that we want. It might be able to, but the way we've been doing it doesn't. It doesn't generate environmental protection, obviously, but it also doesn't generate well-being. We are now living in a world of high consumption, but extreme anxiety, stress, and in many ways, many people, even those with money, don't experience the levels of well-being that they could do in the system. It's one which our growth models lead to greater inequalities, both of income and wealth, but also of geography, of gender, of race. And we've got a growth model that is deeply unstable. We've had a financial crash, we've had a pandemic, and we've got constant environmental crisis. This is not a stable economic system. So those of us, and I count myself one of these, I will out myself here as a post-growther, who argue that we should be moving towards a post-growth economics and a post-growth society. The argument is that we should be agnostic about growth. That is, we should not take a view directly about growth. Growth agnosticism is the phrase of Kate Raworth in the Donut Economics, but instead we should focus on the things that we want. And in a recent report for the OECD that I wrote called Beyond Growth, I and a panel of economists that were commissioned by the OECD Secretary General came up with 4 overriding goals that should be the objectives of economic policy, which are environmental sustainability, reducing inequalities of a variety of kind, enhancing well-being, and system resilience, trying to get more stable systems that are not subject to catastrophic shock. These 4 goals should govern economic policy, and whether or not they generate growth is a secondary question. If you could get all of these things and still get some growth, so that people's incomes were rising, well, that would be a good thing. It, of course, has to be environmentally sustainable and reduced inequalities globally, not just at a nation state. But if there were some growth to be got out of these objectives, achieving these objectives, well, that would be fine. But growth is not the objective. And you don't get these things simply by trying to get growth. What does that mean in practice? Well, I think it means, on the environmental side of this, that you have to operationalize the idea of environmental limits. If it is true that there are planetary boundaries which are governed by the biophysical laws and systems of the Earth, then you have to insist that we will respect those. And we did this in the 2008 Climate Change Act, which I helped to write when I was a special advisor to Gordon Brown, based on the ideas actually in my book, The Green Economy, which was published in 1991. So it took quite a while before we got from those ideas to an act of parliament and an economic system which enacted them. But the 2008 Climate Change Act basically sets environmental limits around the UK economy. The Act says that by 2050, and it's been amended, so it now says by 2050, the UK economy will be net zero in greenhouse gas emissions. And between now and 2050, every 5 years, we will produce a carbon budget for 15 years ahead, which is the total amount of greenhouse gases that can be produced by the British economy in that 5-year period. And we will lay that down in the law, and we will then make it part of the law, a legal obligation on the government to produce a plan that lives within those limits. And that structure of policy is bringing greenhouse gas emissions down in the UK towards net zero. Now, we're off track right now, and so we're now in a real test of whether this act actually does force the government to reduce emissions in line with the targets. But what we had last week, which was the announcement of the new target for 2035, which the government has announced, which is a huge cut, 78% cut by 2035 in our 1990 emissions. And our 1990 emissions are the baseline, because that was a high, is a huge cut. Where does that come from? It comes from the Climate Change Act. The Climate Change Act requires that an independent committee called the Climate Change Committee recommends to the government what its 5-year budgets should be, 15 years ahead of them, which is why it's being done now for 2035. And the government doesn't have to agree with it, but it is under quite a lot of pressure because of the methodology of the Climate Change Committee, which includes economic and social concerns and so on. The Climate Change Committee is a very broad-based independent committee. It's very hard for the government to go against the recommendations of the Climate Change Committee. And it has not done so yet. George Osborne tried, interestingly, in 2011, but he was forced back on it. And this government has decided to agree with the Climate Change Committee. That's how we have a 78% reduction, which is going to be put into law, and how we've got net zero put into law. My argument is that we now need to do this, not just for greenhouse gas emissions, but for all the other environmental factors that we need to limit and to reduce. So that list that I showed earlier, we need to do this for biodiversity loss, for soil depletion, for resource use, for pollution, and so on. And we need to define the UK's fair share of global resources, or our own share of our own natural environments, and say, where do we want to be in 2050 or a little bit earlier? What is the trajectory to reach that? And then we need to put those limits into law and to legally oblige the government to produce plans and policies that can achieve them. I've called that a Sustainable Economy Act. It's modelled on the Climate Change Act, and it's actually modelled on my proposals in the Green Economy, as I say, which is now quite an old, it's 30-year anniversary this year of that book. And that seems to me to be the way in which you operationalise the idea of environmental limits. Within that, we also need inclusive growth, as it's often called, which is more equal growth in which opportunities, income, wealth, power are distributed much more equally. We need a whole bunch of social objectives which can mean that we enhance well-being, and we need to make sure the system is resilient. So the Sustainable Economy Act, the environmental limits, are by no means the end of the policy framework. There's a lot of other stuff to do. I put capitalism question mark at the bottom there. Many people want to say, well, is this possible within capitalism? If you did this, would this be not capitalism? Naomi Klein wrote a famous book in which she said that the only way we can deal with climate change is by getting rid of capitalism. I thought that was a very weird way round to put it. It seemed to me that we needed to deal with climate change, and in that way we would change capitalism in doing so, and we were already doing so. In fact, the Climate Change Act is changing the kind of capitalism that we have in the UK, and so on. It seems to me to be a very odd argument to say that we can only deal with climate change if we first get rid of capitalism, since I can tell you it's much easier to get rid of the things that cause climate change than it is to get rid of the entire economic system of capitalism. I would much prefer to have the climate change objective than getting rid of the whole of capitalism. Whether or not it is possible to improve, to live within environmental limits under capitalism is a very interesting question. It seems to me that we should try doing it, and then we'll discover what kind of economic system we have. But that's a good debate, certainly to have within the academy. So let's move on to a green economy. Can you not see the headings? I just realised. Have the headings all been invisible?
No, they're all good. They're
all good. Fine. Okay. I'm not quite sure how much of my screen you can see. So what does a green recovery mean? Well, Lots of people, including this paper produced in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy last year by Nick Stern, Cameron Hepburn, Dimitri Zengelis, Joe Stiglitz, and various other very well-known economists, have been analysing how an environmentally focused recovery from COVID would fit economically and environmentally. And they look at a whole range of different environmental investments, and they conclude that these are very job rich, so they provide a lot of jobs. Many of them are quite cheap, that is pound invested for pound of output, and that they have multiple co-benefits. And the kinds of things that they are looking at, and everybody else now talking about a green recovery is looking at, are homes and building insulation, transport investment of various kinds, all kinds of energy, renewable energy, smart energy, demand management investments, high-speed broadband, which is one of the things we need to do to live with a lower environmental footprint. We need very good broadband, which enables us to work from home, and so on. Lots of adaptation measures, flood defences, coastal defences, and so on. Lots of nature conservation, tree planting, land management, peat management. Lots of waste management and recycling, circular economy measures. And then there are things like research and innovation and skills training, which are themselves job creators. And then the really important one, which is almost always lopped off the bottom of this list, but I insist on adding it, which is all the things that we want to do, particularly in the care economy, and I would also say actually the cultural economy in arts and culture, which are not specifically environmental, but which have very small environmental footprints. Caring and artistic and cultural production, which I think should be on there, but I couldn't fit it in on the bottom, are low environmental impact, high value, high well-being production activities, great sources of employment, and should be regarded as part of our green recovery package. So it isn't just about the things that affect nature, it's also about the things that we can do that generate a lot of value, a lot of jobs, but have very low environmental footprints. How would we do this? Well, the first thing obviously here is fiscal policy. In order to get a green recovery, we need to spend more. Partly we need to spend on the things that I've just listed, but partly we just need to spend in general to provide the demand, which then leads companies to invest, to improve productivity, to employ people. So we need more public spending. There's a big macroeconomic debate going on now, as I'm sure you're aware, on how much we can afford to continue spending. Now think the only limits to spending and borrowing are your interest payments. When your interest payments are very low, as they are now, because we've got extremely low interest rates, and when the risk of inflation is very low because we have a lot of spare capacity, then you can spend and borrow a lot more. That's a macroeconomic debate, but it's absolutely critical to the green recovery one. Secondly, we need to do a lot of industrial strategy. Mariana Mazzucato and her ideas about mission-oriented innovation, in which we choose missions for where government should support innovation, one of which mission should be decarbonisation, and another one, more general environmental improvement, is now all the rage, quite rightly. And many people in government, in the European Union and so on, are now picking up on Mariana's ideas and going for this. This is central to a green recovery. We also need to make sure that our industrial strategy has good geographic distribution. This is the government's so-called levelling up agenda, but there's no point in just producing high quality jobs in the southeast, in the golden triangle of London, Oxford and Cambridge. They need to be all over the country. We almost certainly need a national investment bank to do this. Interestingly, the government, never enamoured before of public ownership, has created a national investment bank. At least they've called it a national infrastructure bank, but it is basically the proposal that Labour made at the last election. The Scottish National Party in Scottish government has also got a Scottish investment bank. There's one in Wales. Most countries have them. We've never had one in the UK. Well, we did do for a short while. We had a green investment bank, but the government got rid of that just when it was beginning to show just how useful it was. We need just transition policies. It's all very well talking about the green jobs in the nice things that we like, renewable energy and energy efficiency and so on. But a real transition to a net zero economy is going to have to do tremendous, have tremendous change in sectors that are high carbon, in the oil and gas sector, in steel and so on. You can produce steel in green ways. There's some really interesting reports now coming about how to do that. It's very difficult to produce oil and gas in green ways. That's going to have to decline. So what happens to the 100 100,000 jobs or so that are dependent on the oil and gas sector or more, we're going to need very active just transition policies to make sure that we're providing jobs for people where they are. The last huge restructuring of the British economy in the 1980s did that very badly. We're going to need to make jobs and skills available for young people, but also I would say for older people who also find it difficult to get work. And we're going to have to make sure that we have an international dimension to this. We have to make sure that our trade policy and our environmental policies are consistent with environmental justice globally. So how does this relate to a Green New Deal? Well, final comments. We've all heard of a Green New Deal. What you may not know is that the Green New Deal was invented as a term. Actually, Thomas Friedman, the American writer, says he invented it in 2007. But in general, in the UK, it's thought of as having been invented by a group of people, including Caroline Lucas, the Green MP, George, was George Monbiot in that? I'm not sure actually George was in it, can't remember. Colin Hines, Larry Elliott, the Guardian's economics editor, and a few other people formed a group they called the Green New Deal Group. And after the financial crash in 2008, said in order to recover from that, we need a New Deal and it should be a Green New Deal. So that was the first invention of that. And they made various proposals for the recovery after the great financial crash, some of which were done, but not very many. And then, of course, 10 years later, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez famously picks this up as part of, with kind of incredible vision, as part of her election campaign for her congressional seat in New York. She said, we need a Green New Deal. I actually don't know where she got the phrase from, whether she'd kind of seen the earlier stuff. I talked to some of her people and they said they had certainly seen the earlier British stuff. But anyway, AOC, as she's now universally known, has made the Green New Deal her own. That down there on the bottom right of this is the resolution that she put into Congress with the veteran, rather cleverly with the veteran Democrat Ed Markey in 2019. And we've now got a Green New Deal group in the UK, which is that bottom picture, who are promoting all kinds of ideas. And the interesting thing about all of this is that to some extent, this is about industrial strategy and fiscal policy for a green recovery, but to some extent, it's much more than that. It's a prospectus for a new kind of economy and a new kind of society. And it has many things in it, for example, free healthcare, free universal healthcare in the US, which are much broader than just the simply green agenda. And the Green New Deal in that sense is a great label and symbol of a different kind of economy. So this is an interesting debate we now have about recovery. It starts, in my view, it has to start with the founding principles of ecological economics, because they are the only way we can think about this. But it ends with really interesting discussions about a Green New Deal and the future of capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Yeah, that was very interesting talk, very good introduction to ecological economics as well. We have a few questions in the Q&A. If anyone else has any more questions, please just send them in and we'll try and get through all of them in the time that we have available. Okay, so we'll go firstly with Pal on the chat. Has asked, well, has firstly said, thank you very much for the inspiring talk. What do you think are the most important questions / issues to be resolved to support a transition towards a post-growth society? Or put differently, what would you recommend social sciences students to focus on in terms of skills and research areas, especially those planning to go into academia?
What a great question. Well, there's a whole bunch of engineering and biologically based research that needs to be done. If the task is to try and have an economy that lives within environmental limits, then as we all know, we don't have the technologies to do that yet. We certainly have the technologies which can radically reduce our environmental impacts now, and those exist, but there's much more innovation to do. And there's a whole bunch of stuff for the people who are kind of thinking of engineering of various kinds, including biological engineering of various kinds, lots of work to do in agriculture and so on. I think for the social scientists, we have in many ways a more challenging question, which is how do we live in this kind of world? Because it isn't just about technologies. Technologies are embedded in society and technologies create patterns of consumption. How do we live? And how do we feel that we're living well in such a way that this will be politically attractive and publicly and socially attractive in a world of vastly reduced environmental impact. And that is partly about how we organize institutions. You know, we've seen this over the last year, which is that we moved from an economy in which most people travel to work to an economy in which most people now are not traveling to work. We should be careful about not overestimating this. There are still quite a lot of people, mainly in manual jobs, who are still traveling to work, but almost everybody who works in an office is no longer traveling to work. And we've discovered that we can do things that we didn't think we can do before. There are losses and costs as well as benefits and gains from that. But that's been a very interesting experiment, a forced experiment in how we can live with less environmental impact. That wasn't its goal, but that is its impact. I don't think business travel will be restored to the way it was before. I actually think a lot of people will want to go into work, but I don't think they're going to want to travel overseas very often. Now that you can have a decent meeting on Zoom or and other platforms are available, I don't think many people in business or in academia are very often going to say, let's waste 5 days having 6 hours worth of meetings. And of course, waste all the carbon. So that's an example of how the social institutions and the kind of consumption patterns and lifestyles need and can, we've already discovered, change to live in an ecologically sustainable economy. And that is a deep question for society and for social scientists, it seems to me, and that's what I would like us to study. And for those of you who are kind of conventionally macroeconomically inclined, we've got a big macroeconomic task. Macroeconomics has more or less ignored this subject. We've got a few integrated assessment models which stick very faulty equilibrium stochastic growth models into and put some environmental variables on them. Very, very few people are looking at the macroeconomics of a sustainable economy. Tim Jackson, Peter Victor, the great pioneers of this. We need many, many more macroeconomists into this field.
Lovely. I'm just going to quickly jump in before everyone else's questions and ask my own personal question. What do you think?
Yes, prerogative, everybody.
I'm sorry, I have to. What do you think the place for behavioural economics when it comes to green consumption and the effect that this, I don't know, introducing kind of a behavioural, more green behavioural economics into ecological economics could have as within economic kind of disciplines?
Well, I think, I mean, behavioural economics has quite a lot to contribute, probably slightly less than some of its proponents have suggested, in that much of behavioural economics is kind of focused on how we behave as individuals, what's the role of human psychology within behaviour. So, for example, heuristics and rules and anchors and so on. But in fact, we also know that institutions and social structures also make a massive difference to the way we behave. We really mustn't, as we now know, we mustn't reduce racism to the behaviour of individuals. We must also look at structural and institutional factors. And that's also true, of course, with regard to the environment. We can all consume less. We can all consume, we can all have a bit more energy efficiency, but the structure of our energy system is not a function of individual choice. It's a structural institutional factor. And our own behaviour, actually, the most important one is voting. It isn't consumption, about whether we vote for greener governments or not, if we want a different energy system. So behavioural economics has a useful role to play. There is something about personal consumption, which I think is really important. You know, we will have to get used to travelling less, flying less, driving different kinds of vehicles or none at all, and so on. But I don't think it's the most important. If you want, apart from ecological economics, which are the big changes, which are the big sources of plural economics that we should be looking at? It's institutional and evolutionary economics. We need to understand how technologies change, how institutions change, what are the path dependencies in the existing technologies and structures that we've got. If you're looking for which branch of heterodox economics to go into, I would go into institutional and evolutionary economics more than I'd go into behavioural if you want to deal with these issues.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we'll get back to everyone else's questions. Thank you, everyone else. So let's go for, okay. First one from Finn we'll go for. Many of the suggestions offered for a green recovery seem to require very strong institutions. Are these big missions and fiscal packages achievable to a developing country without them, particularly as the growth is likely to be in these places and carbon-based energy remains the cheapest?
Well, look, I'm really glad that somebody's asked about the developing world, because my arguments are very much industrial economy based, rich countries, where growth is clearly much less of an imperative. Many people are plenty well off enough. And our primary problem with consumption is the distribution of income and wealth, much more than it is just having more of it. And in most developing countries, in fact, all developing countries, and I don't like the term developing, it suggests that we've reached some stage that other countries should reach, which I think is not consistent with the facts. But low-income countries need more conventional GDP growth. They need more income, and they need a lot more income if it's going to reach the people who are currently in poverty. And of course, that's going to happen because that's what people want. So this whole prospectus in developing and emerging economies in low-income and middle-income countries is very different, I think. And I don't think you can simply say that the sorts of things that I was talking about with regard to rich countries, advanced countries can just be transferred over. Some of the technologies can. I mean, there is no reason to go down a fossil fuel based route now in most low income and emerging economies. Obviously, those that have fossil fuels will be very inclined to do so because that's a source of exports as well as energy. But for those that don't, just importing fossil-based energy from somewhere else is not a brilliant economic strategy when you can deploy solar and wind technologies in particular, and they are now very near parity or below parity with fossil fuel-based energy. So some of this, particularly on the energy side, can certainly be done in low-income countries. Urban development is critical in low-income and middle-income countries because urban areas are growing very rapidly. If they grow on an American model, which is very, very dispersed cities with huge footprints, I mean, literally footprints in the sense, not literally footprints, cities don't have feet, but literally large areas on an American city model, that's a disaster environmentally. It uses up vast amounts of resources for travel and in concrete and so on. So the goal of getting emerging and low-income countries to build more compact cities, which are much more like European model, much higher density, much more compact physically, which enable people to get around through public transport, walking and cycling and so on. That's a real priority, and that can be done. And various countries and cities are trying that around the world. The C40 group of major cities around the world is pioneering lots of work around that. So there are things that I think which can be applied here. I think the whole consumption model, what does it mean to live more in a lower impact environmental way in an emerging economy, and is really interesting because the cultural context is different. I think, however, the questioner has, Finn, if that's who it is, has put the finger on the nail on the finger on the nail, the finger on whatever it is, whatever metaphor I'm looking for, which is the institutional capacity. We find it hard enough in developed countries to develop institutions which are capable of doing any of this stuff. And in countries with weaker national states and where which are not as well, and which have not been able to do this before, I think that's much harder. So the institution building, which we find hard enough here, is often much harder in low-income countries in particular. So that is a real challenge.
Lovely. Now, a nice segue, we're going to talk about developed countries. Zach has said, thank you for your talk. Can you elaborate more on the extent to which developed countries have outsourced their environmental impact, and how difficult is this to measure, and what does the literature say?
So developed countries, if we're going to use that term, the advanced or rich countries have absolutely outsourced their environmental impacts. I mean, from the very beginning. Let's be very clear about this, which is something that is now emerging not just from the environmental field, but from somewhere else, which is that our entire industrial economies were based on slavery and colonialism. And you cannot understand why we are rich or how we are rich, let alone, of course, why we are made up of who we are made up now, without understanding colonialism, and colonialism starts with slavery. And colonialism is the history of environmental extraction. What we did was we developed what are now the developed countries of Europe. We went overseas and we plundered the resources and we built our industries on those. And we did it through slave labor and then colonial labor. And so this is not just a kind of 20th century phenomenon. This is absolutely embedded in Western capitalism. And it is now going on in Chinese capitalism too. So China is investing and extracting resources from all over the world and buying land. I mean, literally buying vast amounts of land, because China's industrialization is being organized in resource terms in a rather similar way to European industrialization just 200 years later. This is unsustainable, and of course, it makes the countries that are the victims or the objects of that process, it impoverishes them. It obviously raises their incomes relative to what they might have been before, but it reduces their own capacity to develop and impoverishes in very many other ways. So this is not a sustainable model. It's not sustainable for China, or it is sustainable for China. It's okay for China, but it's not for Africa and Latin America, which is where all the resources are now being taken from. And it is possible to measure this. So the ecological footprint literature, which was invented by a guy called Matthijs Wackernagel, who's still doing it, and Bill Rees at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver in the early 1990s. That methodology of ecological footprint counting is pretty robust, actually, and they've developed and improved that methodology over time, and that enables you to see, by doing basically input-output tables of where the resources have come from that contribute to a country's GDP, you can see how sustainable, how large a national economy's footprint is. And they have some rather nice ways of expressing that. You know, how many planets would it take for every country in the world to use resources in the same way that the UK takes? And that's a rather nice way of saying this is unsustainable. So this can be done, and it's very important that we do it, because if we're serious about this, we have to do this in a way that is globally just, and that means we have to reduce our impact much, much more than we might have done if we didn't count the fact that much of our impacts are occurring in the south of the world.
Yes, lovely. Okay, we have time for maybe...
I can stay on a bit longer, Nina, if you want to, and if other people are willing to stay. I don't want to force people to do so, but if there are some questions that you'd like to ask, I'm happy to stay on a bit longer.
Okay, as long as we're not pushed for time, good. Okay then, so we'll just go through all of them. I was trying to figure out, which ones can I ask together? Perfect. Okay, so Maya says, thanks, Michael. It's really, really interesting. I'm wondering about your criticism of Naomi Klein's assertion that we must end capitalism to save the environment. If we appreciate that growth is incompatible with ecological principles, how can we continue to operate with capitalist productive relations? Necessary premise on growth.
Good question, and I can't stay on long enough to answer that one fully, I don't think. So my criticism of Naomi Klein wasn't with the argument that it may not, that it isn't possible, as she would put it, to have an ecologically sustainable capitalism. I don't know whether that's true or not. And the reason I say I don't know whether it's true is because capitalism is a very mutable thing. Capitalism is not a single thing, it's many different things. And the kind of capitalism we have now is very different from the kind of capitalism that I grew up in when I was the age of, I suspect, many of you in the audience. We didn't have the internet then. And we had no digital technology at all when I was growing up. And that was still capitalism, but it was a very different capitalism. Google did not exist. Amazon did not exist. So capitalism changed. Capitalism is different in Germany from the UK. It's different in Sweden from the UK. In Sweden, there's nearly everybody belongs to a trade union. And it's different in Korea and China and so on. So we have capitalism is at one level a thing. And you could argue that the core capitalist relations are the same in all these systems and all these different historical periods. But it's really not very helpful to understand how you might change it if you assume that it is a single thing and we just need to get rid of it. So my interest is in how you change the current system in order to achieve both the environmental goals that I hold and also my social goals, inequality, reduction, well-being, and so on. And I want to do that in a way that looks politically feasible, because I think if it looks politically infeasible, then it won't get enough popular support and it won't happen. And in order to do that, we're going to have to make reforms of this system in incremental ways. Now, they should be as radical as we can make them, but I don't think we're going to shift from our current system to an ecologically, socially sustainable utopia in one go. We're going to do it through a series of policy measures, and the Climate Change Act is a good example. And a Sustainable Economy Act, if we did that, which I think is possible, would be another bit, would be another part of it, but it wouldn't be all of it. And in that process, this can only occur through a political process in which there is sufficient consent, at least of the people, to elect a government to do that. And it will be incremental in form, even if its end goal is very radical. And in that process, what it seems to me will happen is that we will change capitalism. Each time we make some good reform that improves its social and environmental impacts. This is assuming we ever got into power to do it, of course. But every time we did that, we would be changing capitalism. And I'm very happy to say that by the time we finished that process, it might be we had something that looked so different that we would say, you know, we've actually got rid of capitalism here. This is no longer a capitalist system. We'd almost certainly have to change the banking system, which is fundamental to capitalism. I don't think we can do this by having private, the banking system largely private, because I think we need to direct finance into the things we need. So there would be a big change in capitalism. But for me, this is a process of, firstly, political organization to get governments that want to do this and publics who support it. And then it's a process of policy change. And if at the end of that, we discover that we have a system that we no longer think should probably be called capitalism, that's great. What Naomi Klein was saying is, let's get rid of capitalism first, and then we can get climate change acted on. Now, I actually genuinely don't understand what that means. I don't see a system that you could say, right, we've got this system, but we want that system, socialism, so let's replace that one with this one. I don't understand what that means. And it seems to me a terrible prospectus for young people who are looking at a future which, if we don't get to grips with climate change now, are looking at a future which is uninhabitable. I don't want to wait until we've managed to overthrow capitalism before we start acting on the climate. We can start acting on the climate now. In fact, we already have done. And we need to do that now, not wait for some future moment when we've got rid of capitalism. So I just think Naomi's got it the wrong way around. Let's act on climate now within our current system, within our current political system, and then let's discover what we've done to capitalism when we get to the end of that process.
Lovely. And speaking about the now, a few people have asked very similar questions on how optimistic, or do you feel optimistic that the UK or the world in general, how well we will do to meet the targets and avoid the runaway climate catastrophe that scientists have warned will happen should we not meet these targets? Or how optimistic are you to respect to achieving a paradigm shift on time? So
these are fantastic questions. Being a Gramscian, I always use the famous Gramscian maxim of pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. My own version of this is, you know what the definition of an optimist is? It's a pessimist not in full possession of the facts. The problem is that if we look at this from the point of view of what is likely to happen, so if we're betting on the future, you would not bet on us achieving ecological sustainability within the next generation or getting on that path. That is not how the world currently looks, and it's not what the trends show. So if you're saying, is optimism a question of essentially betting on the future? Do you think this will happen or not? Then my pessimism of the intellect, my facts tend me to say, no, it probably won't. But what a useless thought that is. What does that do for us to say it probably won't happen? Well, if it does anything at all, it probably makes it more likely that it won't happen. Because if you look at the world and say, this isn't going to happen, what are you likely to do? Go and act or go and have a pint? If we treat our lives and our politics as about predicting the future and then saying, okay, now I'll behave because that's what I think is going to happen, none of us would ever act at all. You'd never have any change. Did the suffragettes think in the 1890s that they were going to get the vote? I don't know. If you'd asked them to bet on it, would they have bet that they'd get it? No, of course they wouldn't. Would Martin Luther King have said, yeah, I think this is going to happen? No. You act in the world by putting aside your pessimism of the intellect and going with your optimism of the will, which is basically hope. And hope is always there. You never, ever extinguish hope. And there are always resources for hope. There's always something going on in the world which gives you some resources for hope. Greta Thunberg is a resource for hope. Joe Biden right now is a source for hope. To be perfectly honest, the 78% announced by the government a couple of weeks ago is a source for hope. Fridays for Future are a source for hope. The technologies that we've been talking about are a source for hope. Grab the sources of hope and say, I'm going to act in the world because I don't want to be part of the problem. The problem is fatalism. The problem is that if too many people say it isn't going to happen, so I can't be bothered to act in the world, whether personally or politically, then you make it more likely that it happened. And of course, fatalism is literally fatal in these circumstances. So don't ask whether it's going to happen. Say, could it happen? The answer to that is definitely yes. Take some hope from wherever you can find it and then go and act.
Lovely. I hope everyone's inspired to do some sort of small act, at least in the next few years, on how they can help with climate change.
Your big acts of voting.
True. Okay, so Marcus has said, firstly, thank you for your talk. How polite everyone is. My question is, what do you think is a better way of improving energy consumption and carbon emissions? Non-price interventions like education, or price interventions like permits to pollute?
All of the above. We definitely need pricing. Carbon is ridiculously underpriced. Of course, we have an energy pricing scheme. We have a climate change levy, which is a UK policy, and we have a EU emissions trading scheme, which we're kind of not in anymore, but we have pricing policies. But they have not really driven very much shift in energy mode. They've driven energy efficiency a bit, mainly in production rather than the home. But the real thing that has driven the shift from fossil-based fuels to renewables has been a combination of mandates, which are a regulated form, a form of regulation, in which energy companies have been told you have to source a certain percentage, a rising percentage of your energy from renewable sources. That wasn't pricing, that was regulation, coupled with innovation, in which we put money into, and actually, to be perfectly honest, the Chinese have put a lot of money into innovation, which has brought down the cost of those technologies. And in fact, that's a very interesting policy nexus, as I have called it, which is the relationship between the regulation and the innovation. So basically, the way renewable energy was developed in Europe, and therefore globally, because it was the Europe that did it first, was we first regulated by saying we want more energy in the system. Germany did it first, and then the EU did it as a whole. That then created demand for renewable energy, for wind and solar in particular. The extra demand meant that it was cheaper to produce because higher production gives you economies of scale. And it also created an incentive for producers to innovate, to reduce the price and to reduce the cost. As a result of the regulation, they innovated. As a result of the regulation, they scaled up production. Both of those things reduced the price, which enabled the policymakers to say, the cost has fallen, we can have more of this. So they increased the targets in the regulation of renewable energy. Then China comes in and says, right, we're doing this on a mass scale, and the price absolutely plummets. The price of solar power today is about 95% less than it was in 2009-10. The price of wind about 60% less. That is a result of this interesting policy nexus of regulation, energy mandates, renewable energy mandates, and innovation. And this has enabled us now to get to a position where most of the world's new energy is solar or wind. And if you want to know why the Paris Climate Agreement was agreed in 2015, when no agreement was reached in 2009, there is a rather simple explanation. There's actually a lot of geopolitics and various other things, which is in 2009, we, and particularly China, did not know how to move to a low carbon energy system. It looked just incredibly expensive. Between 2009 and 2015, the price of solar dropped by 90%. By that time, the Chinese thought we could do this. And therefore, that process of innovation and regulation has been the driver of the huge change that we've seen over this last decade. And that seems to me to be, alongside a bit of pricing, we definitely need pricing. That seems to be what we need to do as well in our various other environmental impacts that we need to reduce.
Lovely. Lovely. Okay. 2 more questions. If we have time, if everyone has wants to be.
We have lost some people though. I think other people decided that actually that pint was quite a good idea.
Yeah, I think I'll be going for a pint as well in a bit after a few meetings more. So David has stated, there is one view that this can be done through the existing systems, e.g. how to be an anti-capitalist in the 21st century, Eric Wright, partly from the bottom up. But in Mark Carney's recent book, he says that we have to persuade the top end of the economic system to do this too. Are these 2 things possible? Both rule out revolution.
Yeah, if there's a spectrum from Wright to Carney, I'm closer to Wright. This is going to happen because people want it and not because the elite want it. I mean, not initially because the elites want it, because the elites will resist. And by elites, I mean fossil fuel and high environmental impact industries and the financiers that finance that form of economic growth and development. And so it cannot be done from the top down. It has to be done from the bottom up in the sense of popular desire. And frankly, the next generation, young people, are the carriers of this revolution, because it's your future and you need to make it plain to politicians that you ain't voting for anybody now who doesn't make this their top priority. So it has to be done from the bottom up. But within that process, if there is enough pressure in the political system so that the public and governments want to act on it, are there ways of persuading vested interest and elites that they can do this while still making profits? Yes, there are. It's clearly possible to generate profits out of renewable energy as it is out of fossil fuels. By and large, different companies will do it. The fossil fuel companies are finally thinking, oh, maybe we should be in renewables too, and they're trying to move in that direction, but they are mostly still invested in fossil fuels. And so who benefits within the capitalist system will be different people. The financiers will always benefit because they can see where the profits can be made, but we have to squeeze profits out of the high fossil fuel and environmental impact sectors through regulation and pricing and financial mandates. We have to make it a requirement of assets held in banks, in regulated banks, that they have to hold a certain amount of green assets. They can't hold more than a certain amount of brown assets, and that has to be on a declining path and so on. So there are all kinds of policies that we can do, but capitalism is very dynamic. It will find ways of making profit. Slightly different people will benefit, other people will lose, but it will do that. And obviously it's very useful in that process if you've got a few enlightened business people and financiers, of whom Mark Carney is probably one, who say, yeah, we can live with this, let's do this. And that, of course, is how change in capitalism always occurred. So what was the big change in capitalism in the 20th century? It was the creation of the welfare state. It was a system in which the first half of the century, which was small state capitalism, privately owned, was replaced by nationalized industries, high taxes, and a welfare state, and a very interventionist state. Some businesses opposed that, but many businesses said, no, this looks like it's going to create lots of workers with lots of income. We can make money out of these new things. And whole consumer industries developed in order to serve that new economy. And the enlightened business people of their day said, this is fine. We don't mind paying a few more taxes because we've got a whole load of new consumers here. And we don't even mind paying our workers a bit more because that turns them into richer consumers and they'll buy our goods. So there's always what a Marxist might call a fraction of capital, which can see ways of making profit by being a bit more progressive. It comes from below, but if you can persuade a few people at the top to go along with it because they can make some money out of it, well, I'm for that too.
Lovely. And last question from the floor. Do you know the term growth imperatives as part of the post-growth research agenda? Do you think it is fruitful to explore the conditions that seem to force us rich countries to pursue further economic growth in order to understand how to go beyond growth?
Yes, I do. I'm really glad you've raised this, because I didn't really talk about this, and it's part of both the degrowth kind of model and also the post-growth model, which is that growth is not just an economic system, it's a culture. We are, as Western societies, and increasingly societies everywhere, we are incredibly structured around the idea of growth, around the idea that we will get richer as a society, that we will all have more income, and that we will consume more things. And it's a very materialistic form of growth, as well as income-based. We have an obsession in this country with house price growth, and our economy is kind of built on asset price inflation, particularly in homes. And this model is very bad for our well-being, as many psychologists and Greens have said, and it's very bad for the environment. And that is a kind of cultural question, and a sociological, almost an anthropological question about what kind of people we are, what kind of society we live in. And I definitely think that there are kind of cultural sources of growth, and that's the growth imperative kind of literature. And of course, it's all bound up with the economy, because capitalism, growth-based capitalism, wants consumers to want more. I mean, you don't have to be a rocket scientist, a Marxist, or Naomi Klein to see that capitalism wants us all to be dissatisfied with whatever we bought last year and to buy something new this year, and to buy more of it. That is the driving mechanism. So the culture that we live in is very much driven by capitalism, but it's not only that. There's a kind of independence of the culture. So this is really important. We do have to study that. And that's why this is not just about economics. And it's why I would want people to go into institutional and evolutionary economics, because we need to understand the social basis of consumption as well as production. We live in institutions, we live in cultures, and they help drive things, they help drive outcomes, and they help to drive the evolution of economic systems. And that's why we need to understand, what I said at the beginning, that ecological economics has an idea of co-evolution between nature and human society. We can split that up. We can say there is co-evolution of our economy, of our society, and of nature, and we really need to understand the relationships between them.
Lovely, thank you very much. I'm just going to add on to that a quick question. What do you think from the governmental side of things, shifting the view onto other values, shifting our aspirations from growth or GDP within the government to other values such as HDI or other well-being measures, not necessarily completely replacing growth and GDP, but potentially changing the way in which our government and therefore the rest of society looks on where we should aspire to?
So really glad this question has come up too, because this is obviously a very important part of the growth debate, which is, don't we need new indicators of what we really want? So I said earlier that we should, instead of going for growth as our primary objective, we should be going for my 4 objectives: environmental sustainability, reducing inequalities, enhancing well-being, and system resilience. And if we're going to do that, we should clearly not measure success by GDP growth, because none of those are correlated very well anymore with GDP growth, or indeed have ever been correlated with GDP growth. So yes, we need better indicators, but actually we have them already. It is just not true that we don't have these indicators. And we not only have them published by kind of radicals like the Genuine Progress Indicator, but we have them published by government. The British government under David Cameron, because David Cameron got interested in well-being for a short while before he got interested in money, possibly both at the same time, he asked the ONS, the Office of National Statistics, to publish well-being indicators. And if you look on the ONS website, they have 2 sets of well-being indicators, a set of 11 and a set of 43. These are published regularly, and they update their what they call their dashboard of indicators. These exist. The OECD does the same. The OECD, under its Better Life Index and its Better Life Initiative, publishes a whole load of well-being indicators of different kinds for all the members of the OECD. The problem is none of these affect policy, because an indicator only affects policy if it is the thing that politicians and the public and the media are focusing on when thinking about, is our economy improving or not? And we still focus on growth, to some extent employment, and that's about it. And so it's all very well having indicators, but they have to be used, and they have to be used to drive policy, and that's a political choice. And we've never had a politician yet who has said, actually, I'm really interested in these indicators. This is how I'm going to suggest that we measure whether or not our economy is getting better or not. And we've not had a media which can understand that. And to be perfectly honest, we've not really had a public who can understand that. So it's more than just new indicators. We really have to have a politics that is based around that discourse. And then, of course, we have to have policies which can affect the indicators. We know how to affect GDP. We can spend more. We don't really know how to improve well-being. And if we haven't got the policies, then any politician is going to be very cautious about saying, I want to measure success by a subjective well-being indicator. That is asking people, is your life going better this year than last? That is one of the questions that is asked by the ONS and in the OECD's indicators. And it's rather counterintuitive, or perhaps it's not. It's not very much to do with policy. And if it's not to do with policy, if I were a politician, I'd be very nervous about saying that's how I want to measure success, because I'd say I can't do anything about it. It's in the lap of the gods whether people feel better or not, better off or not, or their life is going better or not. So I think this is much more complex than it's sometimes in the ways it's been sometimes discussed. We do need new indicators, but we need much more than that.
Lovely, that's food for thought. I'm aware that some people in our audience are also doing their dissertations on well-being, so I hope they they took something from that. But yeah, thank you everyone for attending and everyone who stayed on for the little extra time. It's been a really interesting lecture and really interesting lecture series as well. But yeah, so that's our pluralism in practice for this semester. If anyone has any more questions, feel free to ask put in the Q&A. I'll be staying behind for a few more minutes. And yeah, email us. And yeah, we look forward to seeing everyone next year for our, hopefully, maybe some in-person lectures, hopefully. But yeah, thank you very much, everyone.